Welcome, everyone. My name is James Person. I spearhead the North Korea International Documentation Project here at the Wilson Center. The Korea Project is under the History and Public Policy Program, which is directed by Dr. Christian Osterman, who is traveling today and cannot not join us. But just to tell you a bit about the project, we go into the archives of North Korea's former communist allies, gather the diplomatic record of these countries to learn more about their relations with North Korea, and through these materials also we try to learn about North Korea's inner workings and foreign relations. Surprising what you can learn from these materials about North Korea. There are a lot of deep continuities to North Korea's policies, to economic policies, foreign policies, to their security concerns, and a lot of these come through in these documents. So a lot of value to these historical materials, both in learning about North Korea's history, but also they're useful for informing policy today. So that's what I do here at the center. But today our event is on a very fascinating episode in modern Korean history, of course, the Korean War, and specifically on the assistance that Romania gave to North Korea during the war. What's fascinating about this is that there was a real division of labor in supporting North Korea throughout the Cold War, or I'm sorry, throughout the Korean War, and then especially in the reconstruction of North Korea during the period of the 3-year plan, and to some degree even later. Very little is known about this assistance outside of the assistance provided to North Korea from China, both in the form of the Chinese People's Volunteers and also other military assistance, and then of course from the Russian documents we're learning a lot about Russian military supplies being sent to North Korea. But again, not much is known about the assistance coming from other communist countries that didn't supply North Korea with weapons or with troops. And so today we're going to get a lot of new information about Romania's assistance to North Korea during the war. Our speaker is Radu Tudorancea. He is a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, specializes in the history of Southeast Europe, regional cooperation in the Balkans, the Cold War in Romania after 1945, on which he's already published a number of books and articles. He graduated from the University of Bucharest in 2000 with a degree in history, then pursued a master's degree in international relations. As a postgraduate student, he achieved a master's degree in Southeast European Studies, a program initiated by the Stability Pact and hosted by the University of Athens. By 2009, he obtained his PhD from Nicolae Iorga Institute of History with the Romanian Academy with the focus on Romanian-Greek relations during the interwar decades of 1919 to 1939. Since 2004, he has been a member of the Romanian-Russian Commission of Historians concerning the Romanian treasure in Moscow. He's also been on the editorial board of Studies and Materials of Contemporary History. Between 2007 and 2008, he helped to develop educational software for Civico. You better... For Civico in the field of history. And he's now working on a book on Romania's aid to North Korea during the Korean War, getting into the Romanian archives, the Foreign Ministry Archive, and also the State Archive, to gather materials on North Korea's, or this assistance in North Korea. He's also, while he's here in Washington, he's been gathering materials from the National Archives on this as well. Our commentator is Xia Yafeng, who is a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He is also an associate professor of history at Long Island University in New York, and he's also a guest professor at the Center for Cold War International History Studies at East China Normal University in Shanghai. Professor Shah he obtained his PhD in modern diplomatic history from the University of Maryland at College Park in 2003. Before that, he served in the Chinese Foreign Service, including 3 years at the Chinese Embassy here in Washington. He has also a number of publications under his belt, including Negotiating with the Enemy, U.S.-China Talks During the Cold War, 1949 to 1972, which was published in 2006. And he has a forthcoming working paper with the Wilson Center's North Korea project on China's aid to North Korea, although the focus is more after the war, so the reconstruction of North Korea, 53 through 60. With that, I will turn the floor over to Radu. We will have time for questions and answers after. We are filming this, though, and it will go live on the web, or not live, but it will go on the web. So I ask that you wait at the time of Q&A to wait until you receive a microphone. So, Radu.
Thank you. First, I should stress that there have been very few significant scientific contributions and data on this topic. In other words, the research is being conducted mostly on virgin soil, and this can be both an advantage and both a disadvantage. Now, regarding the sources, the paper is based on extensive documentation conducted both in Romania and the United States, and I'm referring to various archival documents from National Archives in College Park, Washington, D.C., particularly the State Department records, the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania, the National Historical Archives of Romania, an external relations section, and also the Romanian Red Cross archives. My paper is focusing on studying the stand taken by Romania as a member of the Soviet bloc regarding the Korean War. The research is oriented towards unveiling all the relevant aspects regarding Romania's reactions, from strictly official diplomatic issues to financial and economic aspects. In other words, the paper will assess the nature, consistency, and diversity of the fraternal support offered by People's Republic of Romania to the North Korean regime. Now, regarding the international regional context, the main feature of the Asian regional context of that moment was the emergence in previous year, 1949, of the People's Republic of China. During that period in Europe, Romania, more exactly People's Republic of Romania at that time, was a Soviet-aligned communist state with Russian troops still deployed on its territory. Being a part of the communist camp, People's Republic of Romania was among the first states to recognize the new North Korean state, which occurred on October 26, 1948, only 2 weeks after the Soviet official recognition of the new political entity in Pyongyang. Now, regarding the first Romanian official reactions regarding the Korean War. The quintessence of the People's Republic of Romania official stand concerning the Korean War consisted in placing itself within the peace-loving camp, namely the Soviet bloc, together with the other people's democracies, in dichotomy of the enemies of peace, represented by the Western imperialists led by the United States. The first Romanian reaction concerning the situation in Korea consisted in a communique issued on June 26th, which was very similar to the Soviet one, in which communist authorities in Bucharest placed full responsibility for the Korean War on the South Korean regime, blaming Seoul for the outbreak of the hostilities and invasion. According to that document, I'm quoting here, the military forces of North Korea had to fight back, resisting the enemy invasion initiated by South Korea. However, a more elaborated Romanian reaction was triggered by the US government note issued on July 7, 1950, in which the Romanian officials were informed that the President of the United States has ordered a naval blockade on the Korean coast. The regime in Bucharest had replied by sending a diplomatic note to the American legation in Bucharest on July 12, 1950, stating that American military intervention in Korea represents a direct aggression against the Korean people, while the Security Council resolution was considered illegal due to the absence of the USSR. Moreover, the American intervention was considered as a serious menace to world peace, so that all the consequences and responsibility for the existing situation and future evolutions were placed on American shoulders. The Romanian government had also forwarded a protest note on August 29, 1950, both to Security Council of the United Nations and the Secretary General, in which the American invasion and all the barbarian acts committed by the United States Army in Korea were considered as being war crimes. The purpose of the initiative was to call on the Security Council of the United Nations to adopt, and I'm quoting here, without any delay, the proposals of the USSR concerning the stopping of American intervention and the withdrawal of the invading troops of the American aggressors. Another Romanian official reaction can be considered the speech delivered by Dr. Petru Groza on November 27, 1952, when he referred to, I'm quoting here, U.S. insane plans of world domination and the barbarous and thievish war in Korea, stressing that against the barbarous American and British imperialists, a wave of hatred of the peoples of the whole world is rising in increasing force. Now I'm going to refer to the effective Romanian support offered to North Korea. When it comes to effective Romanian support, I think we should mainly refer to 4 issues, namely the financial support and fundraising campaigns, the North Korean Children and People's Republic of Romania, the Romanian medical expeditionary missions in Korea, and also, last but not least, the propaganda. The first dimension of the help consisted in sending various products which were needed for North Korean war effort. For instance, all in 1953, People's Republic of Romania has sent to North Korea 3,500 tons of gasoline, 1,500 tons of oil, 2,000 tons of canned meat, 500 tons of cigarettes, and also cereals, medicines. All these products were funded from the state budget and were delivered in various amounts during the entire Korean War, and even during the first years after the war. In many cases, the North Koreans themselves were requesting specific products or items. Apart from the support offered from the state budget, the party had often organized many fundraising campaigns, the first being organized in January 1951, in order to rally the Romanian population and collect money and products for the victims of American aggression in Korea. In order to organize such kind of campaigns, the entire political mechanism of the party was fully involved. For instance, to give you an idea, I should mention that for the fundraising event of January 1951, only for Bucharest, more than 2,300 teams were participating, with more than 4,500 agitators. All over Romania, more than 19,400 teams consisting of 50,000 agitators were involved in convincing the population to support North Korean war effort. In order to do that, hundreds of thousands of posters have been printed, together with many other appeals, flyers, and cartoons. The members of the teams were told to accept especially clothes, shoes, non-perishable elements such as rice, bean, flour, sugar, cereals, and so on. For the donation and money, a special bank account was created called CEC 300, the Fund for Helping the Korean People. The results were quite impressive and could be attributed to a certain extent to Romanian propaganda, although, in my opinion, most likely the reactions and the stricto sensu help offered by Romanian citizens to North Koreans had to do more with humanitarian reasons and not with political or ideological issues. The fundraising campaigns were conducted in big cities, but also in the countryside, and even within the Romanian diplomatic missions in Europe and overseas. All the funds were then transferred to Soviet Union. More exactly, they were converted from Romanian leu to Russian ruble, and then transferred from Romanian Central Bank to a Russian bank, namely the State Bank of the Soviet Union, the Pan-Korean Committee for Peace Defense. For instance, only for the first 6 months of 1951, a significant amount of money had been raised for North Korea. Thus, precisely on June 25th, 1951, 1 year after the so-called barbarian aggression of the American British imperialists against Korean people, People's Republic of Romania had transferred to the State Bank of the Soviet Union more than 50 million lei converted in rubles, around, that is, should be around 1,400,000 rubles. Funds were also being raised by selling stamps, envelopes, and various postal services during most of the period of the Korean War. Now we can see the slide number 9, for instance. And it says there, by defending North Korea, we are defending peace. Apărând Coreea, apărăm pacea. In many cases, the Chinese way of raising funds for North Korea was taken into consideration as a good example. A Romanian diplomatic report from Beijing, issued in May 1952, was describing the fact that the Chinese communists were very successful in raising funds, referring to huge donations coming from 70–80% of the Chinese population, allowing the government in Beijing to buy, and I'm quoting here, 3,152 modern planes and hundreds of tanks. A figure which I think it could be exaggerated, in my opinion. So all this for the Chinese volunteers, North Korean forces. The same report was referring to the fact that millions of Chinese workers consented to work one more day every week for 6 months or even more, donating the money in order to help the Korean people. In other cases, the military equipment which was bought with the money raised by the Chinese workers was given the name of a specific factory or even a city. The Romanian support, consisting in money and various products for the North Koreans, had been offered even after the signing of the Panmunjom Armistice. According to an archival document regarding a North Korean diplomatic tour conducted into Soviet Union and other East European countries on July 1956, it seems that North Korea had obtained a significant amount of money from all communist states in the area. Thus, Soviet Union was offering 470 million rubles. GDR was offering diesel engines worth 54 million rubles. Romania, a friendly help of 25 million rubles. Hungary, 50 million rubles. And Czechoslovakia was to send various products worth 50 million rubles. Now, regarding the North Korean children in the People's Republic of Romania, we should mention that thousands of North Korean children had lost their parents during the Korean War, and many were sent to communist countries such as Soviet Union, China, and of course Eastern European countries, including People's Republic of Romania. According to one Romanian teacher, Georgeta Mircioiu, around 3,000 North Korean orphans were taught at special schools in Romania, mostly in the city of Siret, northern Moldova, and in Târgoviște at the Chimir Sen Special School. However, according to a U.S. intelligence report on Romania, a local source was transmitting that in February 1953, in Romania there were 1,000 children from 3 to 7 years old from Korea and China. According to the same American document, North Korean and Chinese children were reported in other satellite countries, such as Hungary, 200 children, at the Chimir Sen School in Budapest, while a few hundred of Chinese and Korean children were reportedly studying in Prague University, and others, 10 to 15 years of age, were studying in Czech elementary schools. The so-called recruitment of the North Korean children had been made by the Embassy of the People's Republic of Romania in Pyongyang, in cooperation with the North Korean authorities, the main goal being that of recruiting children, orphans, from all the North Korean regions. There were many situations in which Romanian citizens have adopted North Korean children, and among the first to do so were the members of the 4th Romanian Expeditionary Medical Mission in Korea. In order to do that, they had to obtain the written approval from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania, Romanian government, and North Korean authorities. In Romania, a special commission was formed with members from the Permanent Committee for the Peace Defense, Red Cross, Central Committee of the Romanian Workers' Party, and it was decided that the first financial issues regarding the accommodation of the North Koreans were to be covered from the so-called Fondul de Ajutorare a Poporului Corean, in English, the Fund for the Helping of Korean People. Over the next years, significant funds were offered from the state budget to the Central Committee of the Red Cross for covering the expenses related to the accommodation and education of North Korean children in Romania. For instance, only for 1953, Romanian authorities have sent 10,500,000 lei for this purpose only. The children were of various origin. Some of them were even street children, while others were the children of the deceased officers or soldiers, or even high-ranking North Korean officials. Some of them still have families in North Korea, but were sent to Romania because the living conditions were better there. The language of instruction was Korean, and the children were taught Romanian, Russian, fine arts, mathematics, and so on. Slowly, they were able to learn the Romanian language, and during the summer and winter vacations, those who had good grades were often sent to holiday camps in the Carpathian Mountains or to Black Sea coast resorts. According to one archival document in March 1955, so almost 2 years after the Panmunjom armistice, there were still 1,753 North Korean children in Romania, in 2 Romanian cities, namely 856 in Siret and 386 in Târgoviște. The above mentioned document is also referring to a decision to integrate the Korean children in Romanian schools so that the Koreans would be able to better learn Romanian language. However, in 1958, a North Korean Red Cross delegation composed exclusively of female members arrived at that school. During the meeting, all the children began to cry, telling the North Korean woman that they were homesick and wanted to go back, even though they were told that the living conditions were much better in Romania. 2 years later, in 1960, all North Korean orphans in Romania were sent back. After their return to North Korea, some of them had the chance to continue their studies, as most of them already knew foreign languages, but many of them were sent to work in factories or mines or were enlisted in the military. Now, regarding the Romanian medical expeditionary missions in Korea. A significant aspect of Romanian involvement in Korean War is related to the several Romanian medical expeditionary missions, consisting of more than 220 doctors and nurses, which have been deployed in Korea between 1951 to 1957 in various places, but mainly in Lanpho and other close areas such as Yongso-myeon and Tongha-myeon. The first Romanian expeditionary mission activated in Korea from April to December 1951, while the last one, the 7th one, was deployed in Korean peninsula from July 1956 to September 1957. All 7 Romanian medical expeditionary missions in Korea have functioned under strict regulations, being placed under the authority of the Romanian embassy in Pyongyang and under Korean military command. The hospital had a military commander, an administration officer, a political officer, and the communication with the Korean authorities was conducted with the help of 2 translators who were classified as speaking Korean, English, Romanian, and German. Out of total 7 medical sections of the hospital, the Romanian Medical Expeditionary Mission was given free, most exactly those who were dealing with most difficult cases, such as surgeries or infectious diseases. Towards the end of the war, People's Republic of Romania has also sent to Korea an anti-epidemical team with vaccines and medicines for fighting the so-called bacteriological weapon. Moreover, the Cantacuzino Institute in Bucharest was requested to prepare anti-cholera vaccine and anti-typhoid and smallpox vaccines for the Korean front. Elena Zeleniuk was one of the members of the first Romanian expeditionary mission deployed in North Korea from April to December 1951, arriving in North Korea from Moscow by train, the Trans-Siberian, after crossing the Soviet Union and China. After returning home, she remembered the horrible experiences from the Korean front, the poor conditions existing in the camp, the hundreds of wounded soldiers, and most of all, the North Korean orphans. These orphans were all calling her Omoni, the Korean for mother, a heartbreaking experience for the Romanian nurse. During that period of time, the Romanian hospital had treated patients, namely wounded soldiers, from both sides, North Koreans, South Koreans, Chinese, and even Russians. But all the doctors and nurses were told that they should not mention to anyone, not even to their relatives at home, about the Russian patients. More exactly, they were told, and I'm quoting here, officially, they are not here. They are not involved in this war. However, the source also remembers that during the evenings, the Russian soldiers were singing a particular Russian song called "Da svidaniya, Mama," Goodbye Mother, which is a song about Russian men going to war and saying goodbye to their loved ones, mother, fathers, brothers. The whole group of the first Romanian medical mission had been invited to even to meet Kim Il-sung, and they were all decorated by the North Korean leader with the Red Flag Medal. The North Korean authorities have even offered a reception for the Romanian Medical Expeditionary Mission. Later, some of the Romanian nurses even received the Florence Nightingale Medal of Honor, a distinction offered by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now I will refer to Romanian propaganda and the Korean War. When it comes to Romanian propaganda regarding the Korean War, the main feature is that the 2 camps were depicted in terms of blunt dichotomy, that of a continuous confrontation between the good, represented by the so-called peace-loving nations, namely the Soviet Union, and the other people's democracy, and the evil, represented by the Western coalition and especially by the United States of America. For instance, Ana Pauker, who was the foreign minister of Romania at that time, referred to the American intervention as being a first step of a bigger plan, having as a final goal a future aggression against China. The most frequent theme of the propaganda was particularly the one in which the United States intervention in Korea was seen, to a great extent, in a similar way to that of the Nazi Germany during the World War II. Thus, the Romanian party officials were drawing parallels between Nazis and Americans, who were depicted as, and I'm quoting here, successors of the maniacal grandomania of Hitler, who most likely will have the same fate as the German Führer. According to an American document issued by US legation in Bucharest, a sort of analysis of the situation in Bucharest, the propaganda was also supported by various organizations, ostensibly respectable, such as Academy of People's Republic of Romania, the Writers Association of the People's Republic of Romania, and even church groups. Another American document is mentioning 3 stages of Romanian propaganda during the Korean War. In the first stage, heavy play was given to various internal meetings of protest, principally of alleged labor groups in factories. There were also mass meetings of protest, such as the one organized in Bucharest in August 1950, when more than 40,000 Bucharest workers joined in mass meeting. In the second stage, resolutions from various entities were issued in order to develop impetus, while the first stage constituted the period of so-called proof regarding the Korean bacteriological warfare, and coincided with the release of the reports of the so-called Committee of the International Association of Democratic Jurists, of the impartial Chinese and Korean investigations and American confessions. The main propaganda tools were the radio stations, the party newspapers or other publications, but mainly Scânteia, the Spark, România Liberă, the Free Romania, Scânteia Tineretului, Youth Spark, and the Lupta de Clasă, this class struggle. To a certain extent, the propaganda used also various posters and cartoons related to the war. Very often, Romanian newspapers were publishing front-page photographs purporting to show American atrocities in Korea. For instance, this was the case of a newspaper issued on January 1951, which showed a row of 11 human heads in Korea being observed by a number of military and civilian personnel under heading, "This is what American barbarians are preparing for mankind." Another characteristic of the anti-American propaganda has been the device of publishing letters and articles purporting to come from factory workers, peasants, students, or mothers. All these letters uniformly followed the standard pattern, which was to convey the impression that the writer is a simple, honest individual who reasons things out logically and who is burning with indignation at some news which he has recently read concerning the United States. The American chargé d'affaires ad interim in Bucharest at that time, James Gantenbein, was stressing that apart from their uniformity of technique and parrot-like repetition of the prescribed propaganda line, a reader would have to be extremely unimaginative not to realize that the background knowledge of the world politics and the ability to write like an editorial writer were fabricated. In some other cases, the party officials in Bucharest were using the situation in Korea in order to underline the fact that, I'm quoting here, such international aggressors like United States cannot or should not talk about violations of human rights in Romania after what they did in Korea. Another diplomatic report from US legation in Bucharest was referring to the way in which situation in Korea was reflected by Romanian propaganda, mentioning the strategy of unsigned foreign editorials, such as the one published on October the 5th, 1950, entitled "Atomic Cannibals Attempt to Interfere in Our Affairs Must Cease," in which the author was mentioning that American aggressors are ruthlessly killing mothers and innocent children in Korea, but dare to talk about the violation of human rights in people republics. However, maybe one of the most acid articles regarding US intervention in Korea was published in December 1952 in Viața Sindicală, the Union Life, and I quote in here. "It is by the burning alive of defenseless persons, by gouging of eyes and machine gunning of prisoners, that culture of those who shamelessly speak in all ways of their role in the progress of human civilization and the role of Yankee imperialism in the happiness of mankind manifests itself." According to American diplomat in Bucharest, these propaganda campaigns did not have much effect on the non-communist citizens. Harold Shantz, US diplomat in Bucharest, was convinced that the majority of adults probably took it with as large doses of salt as they do other propaganda. If they took it seriously, one would expect some at least to shudder, if not to throw things at us when they see Americans. But the legation car carries an American flag, which is consciously observed by less than half of the passers-by. And many of those who stare at it appears to recognize it, but keep poker-faced. If they are glad to see it, they do not share it, they do not dare to show it. But none have yet given any looks of hatred. Now I'm going to refer to the Romanian delegation in Washington, D.C. and the monitoring of the main imperialist power during the Korean War, namely the United States. After the U.S. intervention into the Korean War, following United Nations resolutions, the evolutions of the main imperialist opponent, that is United States, have been carefully monitored by Romanian diplomats in Washington, with reports being sent frequently on a regular basis to Bucharest. Without any doubt, the authorities in Bucharest were interested in all major decisions that American policymakers had to make during the Korean War. In other words, People's Republic of Romania, as a member of the so-called peace-loving camp, has showed a particular interest in the events which were taking place in the United States of America after the outbreak of the Korean War, being focused on gathering information from a variety of sources concerning the political and social evolutions in the United States, and piecing all the information together in order to be useful. The authorities in Bucharest were particularly asking for reports concerning the scale of American military involvement, the way in which the Korean War was affecting American society, predictions and evaluations regarding the strength and consistency of the peace-loving forces from the United States, meaning those entities which were close to communist camp. In other words, they were interested in knowing to what extent those forces in the United States were capable of generating tensions within American society and influencing the evolutions and American actions regarding the war. In this respect, regular reports were being sent from Romanian delegation in Washington, D.C. to Bucharest. The above-mentioned reports were very detailed, covering almost every aspect, from economic to social and military issues. The way in which the war was perceived by the American population was of great importance for the authorities in Bucharest. And according to one diplomatic report issued in August 1951, it was underlined that the war was, and I'm quoting here, definitely unpopular for the majority of the population, although most of the middle-class citizens were somehow accepting the war, mainly due to the so-called clever and widespread American propaganda. When it comes to friendly and peace-loving entities from United States soil, another report is referring to three major groups, namely American Crusade for Peace, National Committee for Peaceful Alternative, and American Friends Service Committee. The first one, namely the American Crusade for Peace, was considered the strongest and the only one that was under direct influence of the Communist Party of the United States. According to that document, the secretary of the above-mentioned entity, Marcel Scherer, established contacts with Romanian diplomat personnel in Washington, D.C., and met with Romanian diplomats several times in order to discuss the Korean War. The other two American peace-loving movements were considered less important. For instance, the National Committee for Peaceful Alternative, although a significant one, was often seen as being under the influence of the American government's slanders regarding the origin of the Korean War. Moreover, the National Committee for Peaceful Alternative was refraining from collaborating with any other left-wing organization, being concerned that otherwise would have been seen as communist entity and discredited. The third entity, namely American Friends Service Committee, was considered even weaker due to the fact that it had chosen another approach, the one of a balance between United States and USSR. Even so, this entity was still appreciated for the fact that it was supporting China's recognition, People's Republic of China, of course. Now, maybe I should refer also to the Korean issue in Romanian literature of that period of time. The Korean War theme had been widely presented even in Romanian literature and of that time. Most of the works, especially poems, were published in newspapers or reviews such as Viața Românească, The Romanian Life, Scânteia Tineretului, The Young People's Spark, or even Scânteia, The Spark, which was the main newspaper of the Communist Party of Romania. Among the Romanian writers or authors, we should mention Eugen Jebeleanu, Veronica Porumbacu, Mircea Bonda, Eugen Frunze, and Dan Deșliu, all of them depicting the fairness of the North Korean patriotic fight and the carnage generated by the imperialistic invaders. The theme related to the alleged use of bacteriological weapons by the American forces in Korea was also present. This was the case of a poem written by Eugen Jebeleanu entitled Războiul Bacteriologic, The Bacteriological War, published in April 1952 in Viața Românească. Another poem by Veronica Porumbacu is dedicated to the North Korean war hero, namely An Sen-hee, depicting the dichotomy between the peace-loving North and the manipulated and corrupted South. Of course, it is difficult to say to what extent these poems were expressing personal beliefs of the authors or they were just propaganda. Most of the above-mentioned writers were decorated later by the Embassy of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea in Bucharest, which wished to express its gratitude to Romanian writers, journalists, or composers who supported North Korea in their writings by unveiling the so-called aggression of American and British imperialists against People's Democratic Republic of Korea. The list was elaborated by the Secția Propaganda și Agitație, Propaganda and Agitation Department of the party, being forwarded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania to the North Korean officials. Among those who were rewarded, we should mention Mihail Sadoveanu, a famous Romanian writer, Dan Deșliu, Eugen Frunză, Mauriciu Vescan, and Veronica Porumbacu. Now, I will refer to the last section of my paper, international events hosted by People's Republic of Romania and the issue of the Korean War. I think it is also important to refer to international events such as the World Congress of Youth or the World Festival of Students and Youth, both in Bucharest during the summer of 1953, and the way in which these events have reflected the evolution in Korea and the issue of responsibility concerning the outbreak of the war. The first international event hosted by Romania, namely the Third World Congress of Youth, brought to Bucharest more than 1,500 delegates and observers from all over the world. Apart from the speeches offered by USSR and other people's democracies delegates, it was the discourse of the American delegate that was expected with biggest interest by all the peace-loving delegates. The speech delivered by the American delegate has confirmed the expectations of the entire audience. More exactly, the young American delegate was deploring US involvement in Korean War, as well as the repeated acts of violence, stressing out that the loss of human life in Korea was completely useless. Moreover, the American speaker has reaffirmed his deep affection for the Korean people and had also used the opportunity to condemn the persecutions against the peace defenders in America, mentioning the case of Rosenberg family, a moment in which the entire audience showed respect with a moment of silence. The situation in Korea was constantly evoked, and the information brought by the head of the Chinese delegation, Hu Yaopang, that the armistice in Panmunjom has been signed, was welcomed by all the delegates with enthusiastic reactions, the North Koreans and Chinese delegates being lifted from the ground and carried on the arms of the delegates. The second international event held in Bucharest was the so-called World Festival of Students and Youth, which started on August 2nd, 1953. Being mainly focused on sports, music, and dance, the festival was also used by the regime as an opportunity to continue the struggle against the so-called reactionary forces from all over the world. Consistent comments were generated by the presence of the American delegation, while American officials in Washington, D.C. had already disregarded the event. The image of the Korean War was still present, and the American delegation was closely observed by everyone. However, its members were considered as being honest youngsters, in sharp contrast with the officials in Washington, D.C., those responsible for atrocities during Korean War, who were considered as being part of the enemies of peace group. Romanian propaganda also used the image of a meeting between one member of American delegation, a young American smelter, and one North Korean young woman, Kuk Sin Bok, nurse, depicted as an effort of reconciliation which could have been initiated only between simply honest and hardworking individuals. The peace message of the honest and hardworking Americans, that is, of American workers, farmers, and intellectuals, transmitted by the American delegation, was seen as a promise for a continuous struggle for peace, friendship, and trust among the peoples of the world, so that the threat of a new war can be eradicated. In conclusion, we may say that the People's Republic of Romania did play a significant role during the Korean War, placing itself within the peace-loving camp, namely the Soviet bloc, in dichotomy with the enemies of peace. The fraternal support, although not military, was a significant one, both in terms of official actions and especially in terms of effective support, namely financial, medical, humanitarian, and also propagandistic support. I think I will finish here.
First of all, I found that Radu has an interesting story to tell, and also at least from the paper which he gave me. Now he gave me his paper last Thursday, so I have been reading his paper during the weekend, and I think that he also has good sources, at least from the Romanian side, although he hid his sources in his paper to me, so I don't really see any notes. But I guess that he had good sources. After reading this paper, I want to know more. So I did a little bit investigation about this topic. At present, I'm writing a book on China's relation with North Korea during the Cold War. So this is his topic is new to me. Is also interesting to me. So in my, as I said, I did some investigation, some research, and I actually prepared a statement here, which I'm going to read a little bit, which I try to provide. What I want to know more is historical background. So how to put his story, because he has a clear story, an interesting story, but he gave us, I would say, a kind of piecemeal. So I want to put in a historical background. For example, during the Korean War, we know that China played a major role. Soviet Union also played a very important role. But at that time, all other socialist countries in the so-called socialist camp or socialist bloc, only Albania. I haven't any. I didn't see any mention of Albania play any role. So I have not resolved this question yet. All other. Even Mongolia provided economic aid of products to North Korea. Now, all other socialist countries, I hope you all know, but just all other countries, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and also Eastern Germany. Of course, Romania. Now, they all provide material aid, medical team, adoption of orphans. To North Korea during the war. So I would ask what's the significance of this story, the Romania story? So I'm going to provide a little bit of historical background. I'm not sure that all what I have to say are accurate, but I try. And also I will provide some suggestions for his further study or research. I try to be finished 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Yeah, okay. So as we all know that the Korean War began 61 years ago, inflicting over 3 years of massive destruction on the Korean peninsula and a tremendous physical and emotional damage on its people. Since then, historians and political scientists have spilled gallons of ink, presenting conflicting answers to numerous questions about the origins, causes, and the consequences of this conflict. These topics have been hotly debated. In the last 20 years, thanks to the declassification of Chinese and Soviet archives during the Cold War, we know a lot more about Chinese and Soviet rule during the Korean War. In this new century, with the further declassification of Chinese, Russian, and Eastern European archives, especially here at the Wilson Center, we all know that the History and Public Policy Cold War International History Project, North Korea International Documentation Project all play a very important role in the declassification and also translation of these news sources from the Communist archive. We all know that. Because of these news sources from the Communist side, that Soviet, Chinese, and Eastern European countries' economic and technical aid to Korea after the Korean War have received some attention. After the Korean War, especially the Columbia University professor Charles Armstrong, his article, which was published in Cold War history in England, 2005. Now he studied the issue of so-called fraternal socialism, the international reconstruction of Korea 1953 to 1962. Basically, he talked about the rule of Soviet Union and Eastern European country, also Mongolia, their economic aid to North Korea after the war. The Chinese historian Shen Zihua, some of you know, that recently he published an article on China's economic aid to North Korea's post-war reconstruction. Now, I also mentioned at the beginning of a meeting that I also mentioned to Radu that there is a PhD dissertation published by a Bulgarian scholar who studied the North Korea. The title of his dissertation is North Korea in the Socialist World, Integration and Divergence, 1945 and 1970 to 1970 from University of British Columbia. Vancouver, 2010. Now his name is Aren Agov. Okay. Now last name is Agov. Now he actually studied the issue of the Soviet Chinese and Eastern European countries' aid to North Korea during the war. But because he studied all these countries, so he's relatively brief on Romania. So by saying that, I think that Radu has a good topic, a good story to tell. As he himself said that I have not seen any article and study on Romania's aid to North Korea during the war. As Radu, he writes in his paper that his research is conducted on the virgin land, virgin soil. Now the protagonists of his story are not senior policymakers in both countries. So he did mention in his presentation about Kim Il-sung, but Kim Il-sung was not the main figure of this story. He also mentioned about the Romania foreign minister at that time, whose name is a lady, Anna Polka. But she was also not the main figure of this story. His story here is Romania's economic humanitarian aid, medical teams, and adoption of Korean orphans, and cultural support to Romania, including propaganda, how the Romanian legation in Washington monitoring the U.S. government and the society, the Korean issue in Romanian literature, and hosting international events such as the World Congress of Youth and the World Festival of Students and Youth in favor of Romania during the war. So his story is more of, I would say, a social cultural history. It's not the political and military history, which we are so familiar with about the Korean War. So I think that's so scholars have been expanding the scopes of the Korean War study. So this is something which I want to congratulate him. So the next question. So you might want to know now, why did Romania, which had very little contact with North Korea before the war? Well, it's true. Romania recognized North Korea in October 1948. But why Romania? Romania isn't, I would say, was not a large country. It's not a large country like the United States, like Soviet Union, China. Why should Romania care about North Korea? Where I try to attempt an answer. The Korean War was not only, as he mentioned, not only a struggle between South and North Korea, but also a contest between the Socialist bloc, which was headed by the Soviet Union, and the capitalist bloc, led by the United States. So we know that China and the Soviet Union were the two largest supporters of the North Korea during the Korean War. China was directly involved. China was the only country in the Socialist bloc provide armies, soldiers, to fight together with the Korean soldiers. China suffered 360,000 casualties in the war. At the end of the war, there were 1.35 million Chinese soldiers in North Korea, which is 3 times larger than the North Korean army. So you can see China's influence and the domination. Also, China provided very important economic, technical aid to North Korea. Soviet Union. Now, we all know Soviet Union supplied arms to the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and also to Korean People's Army. Now, we might also know, only recently, that actually Soviet Air Force was involved in the war. Soviet Air Force was involved in the war. There are 12 air squadrons of Soviet Air Force, 72,000 servicemen actually participated in the war. But they flew north of 30th parallel. And also sometimes they dressed in North Korea or the Chinese uniform. Yeah. So Soviet Air Force actually was involved, not directly, in disguise. Also, socialist bloc country all give aid. I just mentioned that, except Albania, Vietnam because Vietnam had its own problem at this point. Yugoslavia was not involved because although Yugoslavia believed it is a socialist country, but the Soviet Union or other countries did not recognize Yugoslavia at this point as a socialist country. So they all gave, because I would say that it would take more than 2 countries to enhance the regime, North Korea regime's international standing. The establishment of diplomatic relations between North Korea and Eastern European countries came at a time where Pyongyang badly needed international recognition to assert its existence. The Korean War posed a grave challenge to the existence of North Korea. The emerging socialist community was only international heaven for its government. Humanitarian aid had important moral, political, and material meaning, and established crucial bonds between North Korea and other socialist countries. So how did this effort started? And because this was a war year, the North Korea regime, by after September 1950, after the Incheon landing, almost collapsed. So how could North Korea maintain these connections with other socialist countries? Eastern European countries, although they established relation, it appeared that China also here. China, Beijing led the way in coordinating war aid to North Korea. This is also understandable because China had a large army in North Korea. So China was in huge need of these material aid from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. We know that in China that there were many of the fundraising campaigns. Many Chinese actually contribute to this effort as well. So it's understandable that China, because China troops was in North Korea, China was fighting the war, so China was leading the way in coordinating wartime aid to North Korea, given its proximity to the peninsula and its direct involvement in the war. Now, in a meeting in Beijing on February 13, 1951, the ambassador of North Korea in China and the Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai, they appealed to the ambassadors of USSR and Eastern European countries for aid in medical personnel, drugs, and the care of orphans. So China already, the PRC was founded in October 1949. So in the first 2 years, all the socialist bloc countries recognized the communist China and sent their ambassadors to Beijing. So Beijing and Pyongyang not very far geographically. So many of these activities was coordinated by Chinese. Now, in addition, the North Korea ambassador in Moscow coordinated effort to provide aid from Eastern Europe. The North Korean finance minister, now there's a guy whose name called Choi Chang-uk. He traveled to Eastern Europe in 1951 and concluded a series aid agreements with these Eastern European countries. So the aid, as he described clearly, that in several forms, most importantly is humanitarian aid. He mentioned about the medical help, medical teams, Romanian medical teams in North Korea, Bulgaria, Chinese, care for North Korea orphans. Here, I want to give an example. For example, the North Korea orphans, the children, Eastern European country received the North Korea orphans in 1951 and 52. Romania took, now he mentioned about 3,000, but in 1951 and 52, I have a number here, is 500 children. Now, that's 1951 and 52. Now, you mentioned the entire period is 3,000,
No,
if I remember.
I mentioned two sources. One of the sources was mentioning 3,000, and the other one was official one, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs source. Was mentioning what, so 2 years later, 1,753.
Okay, yeah. So Poland accepted 200 Hungary, 200 Bulgaria, 200 the GDR, Eastern Germany accepted 610. China accepted 20,000, 20,000, 20,000. Yeah. So the host country provide transportation, lodging, and education for these children. In his presentation, Radu tell us some of the fascinating details about this, so I'm not going there. Now, another major activity of these fraternal aid or support is economic aid. I have some number here. The fraternal aid in form of delivery was life saving for North Korea, which you know, the North Korea government was also almost collapsed. The American bombing almost destroyed all the major buildings. Now, the Soviet Union provided 610 million rubles as aid. The trade also, although it's war year, but the Soviet North Korea trade continued during the war, although on a much smaller scale than pre-war years. According to East German report from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, socialist aid to North Korea until 1953 totaled 1.7 to 1.32 billion ruble. As follows: Soviet Union provide almost 50%, so it's 610 million rubles. Now China was the next. China provide 562 million rubles.
So which period? After 1953?
This is the entire period
okay.
During the Korean War until 1953. The Eastern European country added together is between 100 and 140 million rubles. Now, that's the figure which I have here. So how to interpret these numbers? What's the significance of this study? Well, how to interpret these numbers? Here's what I try. The Soviet Union and Eastern European country established diplomatic relations with North Korea immediately after its creation in 1958. Eastern European ties to North Korea was mostly symbolic until the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. Although this symbolism meant a lot amidst the bitter rivalry between North Korea and South Korea for international recognition. After the creation, the Korean War accelerated and expanded the scope of North Korea's integration into a larger socialist community. The two rival international systems took more definite definite shape and deepened the process of intra-system integration during the Korean War. 17 countries, now you know 17 countries on the U.S. side, sent troops to UN forces in Korea, headed by the United States. On the other side, okay, the capitalist side or the U.S. side, 17 countries fighting on the side of South Korea. Only China sent troops to help North Korea survive the U.S.-led counteroffensive. So China was a very poor country. You have to remember that China had just experienced more than 100 years of war. More than 100 years of war. It was a very hard decision for the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, to send troops. Now, China was very poor. It's not China today, which we say China rise, but not 60 years ago. So, of course, China needs all these help from the so-called Socialist bloc. Now, the USSR and East European countries provide key political and material support during the war, which prevented North Korea from being internationally isolated and enhanced its security and legitimacy. China was the only, I mentioned about that. So the socialist country also depend on North Korea. Because remember, this was the Cold War confrontation between the socialist bloc and the capitalist bloc. So socialist country depend on North Korea to various degrees as well. North Korea's security became indispensable for the PRC. So why China sent troops to Korea? Now, historians still debate. Is for ideological reason or for national security reason? They don't agree. But for sure, because China obviously did not want the North Korean troops north of Suez-Fraternal, because that was an imminent threat to China's national security. It was also important for Soviet Union, which needed a buffer zone on the Korean Peninsula against the United States and Japan. So although North Korea was very remote geographically, the North Korea became a key foreign policy issue for the Eastern European country as well, which felt compelled to help. Even though on very limited material scale. The new member of the international, because North Korea is a new member of the international socialist community. North Korea was important for Soviet Union economically, although to lesser extent in North Korea depend on Soviet Union. So furthermore, the Korean War was the first significant test for the emerging international socialist system. North Korea survived the war, and socialist system marked its birthday. The war forced North Korea into kind of a dependence relation, because you know that Kim Il-sung and North Korea communist regime was installed by Soviet Union. So from 1945 to 1950, North Korea depends solely on Soviet Union. But by the end of the war, China, by 1953, because China's heavy involvement in the Korean War, so China became a very important factor in North Korea politics. And North Korea, to some extent, also depend on the other socialist country, Eastern European, for example, Germany. Eastern Germany later on, after the war, played a very important role in the reconstruction of North Korea after the war. Actually, the third after Soviet Union, China, Eastern Germany played a very important role because some said because Eastern Germany was also a divided country, so they were sympathetic to North Korea. So now the historian Charles Armstrong, which I mentioned, that he mentioned the period post-war reconstruction in North Korea was the first and only time in that's the Soviet Union, China, and the Soviet allied country of Eastern Europe and Mongolia cooperated in a multilateral development project of such scale. It was the historical high point of international socialist solidarity, one that would never be repeated after U.S. and China fell out in the early 1960s. His point is he wants to stress that the period from 1953, after the war, to the 60s, during the North Korea reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, he found that this was the first time and the only time that these socialist countries come together to do one project. Now, I would argue preliminarily that this kind of multilateral cooperation started during the Korean War. We have to rethink about it. This is just my preliminary judgment that I would challenge his, because we do see from Radu's presentation, now we do see that the communist country, China, Soviet Union, and Eastern European country, they came together to one important project, that is to help the survival of North Korea communist regime. Just very briefly, further suggesting for further work, 2 minutes. My first suggestion is I think that to make a good article or good book, I don't know his plan, whether it's a book or article, he probably have to try to type these episodes together and articulate a major theme out of all these fascinating details. What kind of interesting question can he ask? I think that will be also important. Number two, what is the uniqueness of Romania aid? He might want to compare with East Germany's aid to North Korea and expand his study to include Romania's aid to post-war reconstruction of North Korea. If we want to do a book, he probably want to extend until 1960 or 61. Now that we know from other sources that Romania actually gave 22 million rubles to North Korea from 1953 to 1960. Last but not the least, last is historians always say, so what? He tell all these fascinating stories, so what? So what is the significance of this study? So I look forward to an important study, important article or book from this project. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Did you want to respond immediately, or can we take a few questions from the floor first?
Yeah, just short commentary. So, of course, we can talk about all the other countries of Eastern Europe, but my topic here today was Romanian People's Republic. Okay, and the time was quite short also. So, and about you said what is the uniqueness of Romanian aid? I don't think we can speak about uniqueness. I don't think we can place Romania on a different role than compared with the others. I think we can speak about a group and different ways of, different amounts of money or different way of responding to this event. But I don't think the Romanian case was unique in this whole group.
Great, let's take some questions from the floor. Let me remind you that this will be put up on the web, so if you want the people on to be able to hear your question online, then please wait for the microphone, and also identify yourself, please.
One question, so very brief.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you very much for a great presentation of a relationship that certainly needs more research. It's very needed. I would think that Romania didn't have too much of an autonomous, independent foreign policy at the time. There were Soviet advisors stationed in each and every government agency. There were Soviet troops still stationed on Romanian soil. I think that Professor Shaya Feng asked an excellent question, also gave an excellent answer to that question. Those 17 countries that intervened on the Korean Peninsula did so pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 82 that aimed to restore peace and security, respond to a direct threat to international peace and security. Those countries were very small, the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians. Nevertheless, they were there in order to add legitimacy to an action that was actually counteraction to a legitimate course of action authorized by the UN Security Council. So that was also a role played by the Romanians. I think that it might be interesting to look at the items included in the aid offered to North Korea. 500 tons of cigarettes, in addition to being very harmful, might indicate that much of this aid was going to the Chinese volunteers as well. I don't know if it's
soldiers do need these kind of
things, yes. So I think it might be interesting to look at the logistics, if possible at all, if documents are available, to look at the logistics beyond the point where this aid left Romania.
But the most important part in products was oil. As you know, oil is very important in any kind of war. Okay, of course, Romania was not had Soviet troops on its soil. There were still, so until 1958, we still had around 2 divisions. That means around 60,000 Soviet troops, and so Romania was a Soviet online state, and it was pretty much.
Ria Che with the Wilson Center. I have a couple of questions, but first of all, I wanted to say that the more I listen to your presentations, it's my second time to listen to you discuss this topic, and the more details I find out, and the more interesting it becomes. So I learn every time, even though it's the same topic. So my questions are probably something which you didn't pay much attention to when you were looking at the documents, because these were not directly related to your topic, but those which are of much interest to South Korean scholars of the Korean War. The first is the issue of the biological weapons. North Korea has tried after the war to prove that Americans were using biological weapons, and but it was said that a lot of evidence was fabricated, and North Korea didn't allow international, as far as I know, international team to investigate. So right after the war, so a lot of evidence was lost. When you were talking to these medical personnel, or when you were reading their the stories or memoirs, did you find any mentioning of them treating patients who may have been wounded due to the usage of biological weapons?
No, none. But I do have a document which relates to the fact that a special team was sent from Commentator Institute in Bucharest, specialized for this kind of biological weapons, in order to fight against this. But maybe it was sent just in case but I didn't find any, very solid proof that they were treating patients with this kind of diseases.
Actually, we located the Russian archives and already released them several years ago. Documents confirming that they were not, that these were fabricated. The Soviets were confirming, in fact, criticizing the North Koreans for fabricating these stories of, for creating these stories of Americans using these types of weapons.
But he has them mentioning from the Korean War. Radu, in his presentation, mentioned the documents which I think were during the Korean War.
Yeah, so the document says that they have sent a special team from Bucharest, from Commentator Institute. It's a medical institute. So in order to fight the so-called biological weapons, just in case, but I didn't find any, a special case that X person was treated because had this kind of problem, due to the biological weapon or something.
I think there
is no proof.
Well, there's no consensus even among Western scholars whether there is the biological weapons or not. Even among Western scholars, up to now, they are still debating. There's no consensus on this issue. That's what I know.
And one more thing, which maybe only I was confused about it, but when they were sending the medical personnel, was all medical personnel dispatched to North Korea, even when most of the territory of North Korea was occupied? Because I have read several memoirs of North Koreans who defected to South Korea or to other countries, and they would say that they were treated by Romanian doctors or Hungarian doctors on the territory of China.
I don't know. I didn't find this kind of information, but my information relates to the fact that all these 7 groups were sent precisely in Namfo and in the area around this city. So all these 7 Romanian groups, medical groups, were sent directly to this place.
It was 200 doctors.
220, yes, doctors and nurses.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Just out of curiosity, Radu, you mentioned a Romanian teacher, Georgeta Mircioiu.
Yeah.
It's a very little known story that she was married to the North Korean principal of the school where she was teaching. And she has been separated from her husband for almost 50 years now. She was told that he was dead, he was alive.
Doesn't know anything about her husband.
I was going to ask if you might have an update.
I only know that she is still trying to reach him, but he doesn't know if he's still alive or he's dead already.
And are the North Korean authorities being responsive at all? Are the Romanians doing anything about it to help
As
her?
far as I know, Romanian authorities did try to help her, but they didn't receive any kind of reply from North Korean authorities until now, as far as I know.
Thank you.
I have a question about how detailed are the reports? What kind of reports are you getting from within North Korea? You know, produced by diplomatic officials. Were they in North Korea during the war? Did they evacuate to China? I know. I do have some reports from '53, towards the end of the war, and then just immediately after the armistice was signed, where diplomatic officials were in North Korea, not in Pyongyang.
Yeah.
Outside of Pyongyang. I guess there was most
Due to the war.
right,
Yes.
but most officials from most diplomats from the Socialist camp were I don't know, it doesn't actually list the location of where they were, but they set up
They were
temporary
moved.
embassies. Yeah, sort of. I guess they sort of moved. My understanding is that the Mongolian ambassador is the only one who actually
Stayed. Those 3 years, yeah.
Right.
So, yes, most of the reports are from Romanian embassy in Pyongyang, but at a certain moment, due to the war, the diplomats had to be evacuated, and part of the responsibilities of Romanian embassy in Pyongyang was taken by Romanian embassy in Beijing. This is the. And the Romanian embassy in Beijing was responsible for administrating funds and sending reports to Bucharest, diplomatic reports and so on.
When were they sent back to?
After the war finished, everything was start over again.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions or comments? No. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up here then. Thank you very much to to Radu for his presentation, and to Yafeng for your comments. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon.